Hi guys. Tonight, we're going to slowly drift into a tale that glimmers like a forgotten lacquered comb in a dim-lit Kyoto alley. This story is not just about beauty, nor just about secrets, but about the hidden lives of the Oiran, Japan's most prestigious courtesans, and the deeply guarded rituals they performed when faced with the inevitable truths of life, like pregnancy. From centuries-old tea houses to the hushed chambers of the Yoshiwara pleasure district, this 24-part journey will uncover not only the crazy ways these women dealt with pregnancies, but also what their lives really entailed: grace, sacrifice, secrecy, and the unrelenting pressure to remain desirable, no matter the cost. We begin, as all good stories do, with silence. The kind of silence that creeps in right after the sun sets behind sliding paper doors. Yoshiwara. The name drips like honey. Elegant, tragic, luxurious. It was the pulse of desire, wrapped in layers of brocade and ritual. And at the heart of it, like a rose hidden by 1,000 thorns, was the courtesan. But unlike the illusions painted in kabuki plays or the romanticized fantasies told by sailors and poets, the life of a high-ranking courtesan was nothing short of controlled brilliance. Everything from her walk to the tilt of her fan was choreographed, rehearsed, and honed to perfection. But if you knew how to look, really look, you could see the tension behind the smile. You could hear the weight behind the laughter, especially when she missed a step, especially when she was late. Because in Yoshiwara, lateness could mean one thing: a pregnancy. And pregnancy was both the most natural and the most forbidden thing that could happen to a courtesan. They say an Oiran could command the attention of samurai, poets, and merchants alike. But even she could not command her own body, not completely. Not when the men who visited her room were never permitted to leave a name. Not when contraception was, at best, a superstition, and at worst, a whispered prayer. Tonight, in this first chapter, we meet Yuzuha. She was not the most famous, not the most beautiful, but she was real. Her story, though fictionalized in detail, is stitched together from the lives of many courtesans whose names never made it into textbooks, whose choices remain whispered between layers of history. Yuzuha was 19 when she became an Oiran. That was already old. Most were chosen at 13, trained for years as Shinzo or Kamuro, apprentice ranks, before earning the lacquered hairpins that marked their full ascent. Yuzuha had eyes like wet ink and a voice that danced like wind through pine needles. She was known for her laugh, not too loud, not too coy, and for the way she tied her obi in front. Unlike the geisha, whose knots were at the back, the courtesans of Yoshiwara wore their sashes tied in front so they could be untied, easily. She'd been in service for 3 years when she noticed the changes. Her appetite sharpened, her sleep became restless, and worst of all, she missed her moon. In most parts of the world, a missed period brings a silent dread, or perhaps a joy. But for a courtesan in Edo Japan, it brought only one thing: danger. Not just the danger of being dismissed, but of being discarded, because a pregnant courtesan could not work, could not dance, could not take customers. And if she could not take customers, she could not earn. And if she could not earn, well, there were 3 paths, all paved with silence. Yuzuha did what many before her had done. She took her suspicions to the elder madam of the Okiya, the house that owned her. The madam, Junko, had seen it all. Her own lips had once been stained with safflower rouge. Her own obi once gleamed like gold in the lantern light. But that was decades ago. Now she kept ledgers and secrets. Junko said nothing at first. She poured a small bowl of hot water. Into it, she dropped a handful of crushed dried mugwort and shiso leaves. "Drink this," Yuzuha did. 3 days passed. The spotting never came. Junko's expression tightened. There were other brews, stronger, made of slippery elm and crushed saffron and the boiled skin of unripened persimmons. These were not given lightly. They tasted of bitterness, like biting the edge of a coin. Yuzuha drank them all. Still, the blood did not come. Now things grew urgent. Junko knew that if the brothel owner found out, Yuzuha could be sold again to a merchant, to a rural farm, even to the floating cages of foreign traders looking for exotic entertainment. It wouldn't be called punishment, but that's what it would be. So they turned to the old woman. She lived behind the shrine, down a side alley that smelled of wax and silence. No one knew her name, only that she never smiled, and that she had once been a courtesan too. Her tools were wrapped in silk. She never touched the girls, only gave them roots, tinctures, and a small vial of something that shimmered pale green. "It will work," she said, without looking at Yuzuha, "but you will scream." The madam paid in gold, quietly. The brothel ledger simply recorded it as linen expenses. Yuzuha returned to her quarters, and for 2 days no one saw her. What happened in those hours we don't know. The curtains were drawn, the lanterns dim. Only once did a neighbour claim to hear something, a breath caught sharp like someone biting down on a scream. And then, nothing. On the 3rd day, Yuzuha emerged, pale but smiling. She painted her lips. She combed her hair into its usual tower of lacquered elegance, and she returned to the walkway where men in silk waited with open purses and closed hearts. No one spoke of it again. But Yuzuha was not quite the same. Her laugh changed. It became just a fraction slower, a beat off, like a song played a little too far from the fire. She was not alone. Many courtesans had walked that path. Some quietly succeeded in hiding their pregnancies until a midwife could be arranged and the baby sent off to a temple. Some vanished, and some left more than blood behind. We will explore all of that and more in the next chapter. The second time Yuzuha missed her moon, it was spring. The plum blossoms had just begun to open, their pale petals dotting the air like soft confetti. The district was alive with the scent of rain-drenched earth and distant laughter from street performers. Yuzuha stood at the wooden threshold of her room, watching a pair of children chase a paper ball down a narrow alley. One of them tripped, scraped a knee, and cried. A woman emerged from a nearby doorway, maybe a maid, maybe a mother, and lifted the child without a word, brushing the dust away with one gentle sweep of her sleeve. Yuzuha looked away quickly. In Yoshiwara, no one spoke of children. They existed, of course, hidden behind temple walls raised by old nuns or silent caretakers. Some were absorbed into the brothel system itself, adopted as attendants, trained from birth in etiquette and elegance. Others disappeared into rural villages, their parentage forever left blank in the village registries. But for a courtesan, the idea of motherhood was like a shadow on silk. You couldn't wash it out. You could only try to drape something brighter over it. Yuzuha did not go to Madame Junko this time. She already knew the steps, the teas, the roots, the pain. She sat with her knees tucked beneath her, staring at the fine cracks in the rice paper walls. They looked like branches, spreading, splitting. A kind of map. She traced one with her eyes until it ended at a pinprick of light. That night, she lit no lanterns. Instead, she wrote a name on a slip of paper and folded it 12 times. The name was not the father's. She did not know his name. It was the name of the child she imagined, Sayuri. Small Lily. She burned the paper in her incense bowl and pressed her hands together. Not a prayer exactly, but something close. 2 days later, she fainted during her performance. It was the dance of the willow, the one every Oiran learned to master. Gentle, swaying, delicate. Her silk sleeves were mid-arc when her eyes fluttered shut and her knees buckled. For a moment, the audience thought it was part of the act. But then came the sound, her body striking the tatami. There was a sharp intake of breath, the clink of a dropped cup, and then silence. It was Kiku, her attendant, who rushed to her first. Kiku was barely 16, but clever in ways the courtesan house prized. She helped Yuzuha up with practiced grace, whispering apologies to the clients, bowing deeply as she guided her behind the curtains. Back in her room, Yuzuha lay on her futon, her face grey with sweat. Kiku undid her obi with trembling fingers, loosened the layers of silk, and placed a cool cloth on her forehead. Then she whispered, "Again?" Yuzuha didn't answer. She didn't have to. Kiku reached beneath the floorboard, lifting a wooden slat with the tip of a metal hairpin. From the small hollow, she retrieved a folded cloth pouch. Inside were remnants of the old cures, dried root shavings, a vial of amber liquid, a tightly wrapped bundle that smelled of vinegar and iron. Yuzuha stared at them. "I can't," she said. Kiku's hands paused. This time it wasn't just a whisper of pain. This time Yuzuha felt the weight of something more. Not the child itself. Not yet. But the possibility. The idea that somewhere within her was a thread unwinding, tying her to something she had never allowed herself to imagine fully. A life outside. A place where her name was not a performance. Where she could walk without the clatter of Gita, without the painted smile. Where no one measured her worth by the crispness of her fan gestures or the shade of her lip stain. "Will you keep it?" Kiku asked. It wasn't a question people asked here, but Kiku asked it anyway. Yuzuha's eyes filled with tears, though none fell. "I don't know." That night, Kiku slipped out through the back alley and returned with a bundle of herbs and an envelope of coins. She didn't ask where the money came from. Perhaps she'd sold one of her own ornaments, or bartered with a merchant who owed her a favor. In the world of courtesans, favors were a kind of currency stronger than gold. Yuzuha drank the herbal brew, but only half. She kept the rest in a small bowl, covered with a lacquered lid. Days passed. She stopped performing. The madam told clients she had fallen ill with a fever, and for a while they accepted it. But whispers started soon after. One said she had been chosen by a daimyo, that she was being kept in secret, lavished with gifts. Another claimed she had gone mad, cursed by a jealous rival who burned offerings to the wrong spirit. But the truth was simpler. Yuzuha stayed in her room and listened to the rain. Her body changed, slowly. Her waist thickened. Her skin glowed in a way that even her mirror seemed surprised by. And then one evening, as the bells marked the 3rd hour of the night, a knock came at the side door. Kiku answered it. The woman who stepped inside was tall and wiry, with sleeves stained by tea and time. Her hair was tied back with a string, her face weathered but calm. She did not bow, she did not smile. She looked at Yuzuha once and nodded. "I'm Midori," she said. "Let's get ready." No ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet hum of inevitability. Midori was what they called a shadow midwife. She worked between districts, never staying in one place too long. She had helped dozens of courtesans give birth in secret, always in the quiet hours, always away from curious eyes. They prepared the room with straw mats and boiled cloths. The scent of cedar and camphor filled the air. Kiku brewed rice porridge with slivers of pickled plum, just in case Yuzuha had the strength to eat after. The birth came 2 weeks later. It was swift and silent. No cries echoed in the alley. No drums signaled celebration. Just the breath of a newborn, soft and uncertain. It was a girl, Sayuri. She had Yuzuha's mouth, and the same dimples that had once made patrons laugh and sigh and fall in love, if only for a night. Yuzuha held her daughter for 1 hour, maybe 2. Then Midori wrapped the child in swaddling cloth and tucked her into a woven basket lined with soft moss and a single silk ribbon, the only trace of Yoshiwara she would carry with her. Kiku left at dawn, carrying the basket under her robe. She did not look back. She left the baby at the Temple of the Silver Bell, where orphans were taken in exchange for silence and coin. When Kiku returned, Yuzuha was already up, her face painted, her lips red once more. She sat at her mirror, combing her hair. Kiku stood in the doorway. She smiled, she said. Yuzuha didn't turn. "I know." And just like that, the Oiran was reborn. The girl named Yuzuha placed her hairpins one by one, and Yoshiwara, as it always did, went on. The paper lanterns outside Yuzuha's chamber flickered gently as twilight melted into night. She adjusted her collar in the mirror, tilting her head slightly to one side as she had been taught, allowing her bare neck to show just enough to captivate, but not reveal. Her face, as always, was flawless. The same powder-white foundation. The same deep crimson on her lips. But behind the familiar mask, her eyes held a depth that had not been there before. They held something else now. Loss. Quietly folded and tucked behind a well-practiced smile. Her return to the pleasure quarters was smooth, too smooth. Clients, having heard rumours of her temporary absence, flocked to her with renewed interest. There was nothing men loved more than mystery, especially if it wore silk and smiled like the moon. And Yuzuha was a master of mystery. But there were cracks in the lacquer. Some evenings she would pause while pouring tea, her hand hovering over the cup just a second too long. Other nights she would forget the ending to a song she had sung 100 times. No one noticed, of course, or if they did, they mistook it for charm, the imperfections of a real woman, not a doll. Only Kiku saw the truth. At night, when the guests had gone and the incense had faded to ash, she would find Yuzuha sitting by the paper screen, gazing out into the quiet streets, listening for something that wasn't there. One night, Yuzuha spoke. "Do you think she'll be happy?" Kiku didn't answer right away. She sat beside her, wrapped in a simple robe, her hair undone, falling over one shoulder like dark silk. "I don't know," she said finally, "but she'll be safe." Yuzuha nodded as if that were enough, but it wasn't. Not really. In Yoshiwara, no one ever talked about the after. There were stories, of course, whispers of courtesans who had escaped, who had married their favourite patrons and lived in grand houses by the river. But those stories were rare, polished into legend. Most courtesans aged out, retired into brothel management, or became madams themselves. The lucky ones became musicians or tea-house owners. The rest faded. Yuzuha was 23 now, still luminous, still desired. But she could already feel the tide shifting. New girls were arriving each season, fresh-faced, sharp-tongued, eager to please. They watched her with reverence and competition. She began to count the coins in her personal coffer more carefully. A secret fund, tucked behind the false bottom of her wardrobe. It was nowhere near enough to buy her freedom, not yet, but it was growing, slowly, and then came the stranger. He arrived on a night heavy with fog. The district was hushed, the usual clamour of footsteps and laughter muffled by the thick mist that clung to every wooden beam. He did not wear the robes of a nobleman or the loud colours of a merchant. His clothes were simple, travel-worn, but his bearing was calm, self-possessed. He didn't speak much. When he first requested Yuzuha, she almost declined. She had grown tired of new clients, the awkward beginnings, the forced laughter, but something about the man intrigued her. He gave no name, only bowed and said, "I've come to see the one they call Yuzuha." His voice was low, gentle. In her chamber, he sat cross-legged, his hands resting in his lap. He didn't drink, didn't leer, just watched her with a steady gaze that unsettled her more than any wandering hand could have. She poured him tea. "You're quiet," she said. "I prefer to listen." "To what?" "To the space between your words." That caught her off guard. She studied him closely. His features were unremarkable, neither handsome nor forgettable, but his eyes held something ancient, like he had walked through lifetimes to reach this room. That night they spoke, only spoke, about poetry, weather, the sound of wind in pine forests. And then, when the lamps burned low, he bowed again and left. He returned a week later, and again the week after that. Each time he brought something small, a painted fan, a poem written in his hand. Once, a rice paper lantern shaped like a carp, nothing extravagant, but chosen with care. He never asked for more than conversation. The other courtesans began to whisper. Yuzuha was being courted, chosen. Maybe this was her patron, the one who would free her. But Yuzuha knew better than to dream too easily. One evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the rooftops, the man handed her a small lacquered box. Inside was a single silver comb, not new, worn smooth at the edges, but beautiful. "I was told," he said softly, "that this once belonged to your mother." Yuzuha's breath caught. She stared at the comb, her hands trembling. "How?" "I visited the temple," he said, "the one with the silver bell." Yuzuha felt the air drain from the room. The man reached into his sleeve and withdrew a folded scrap of paper. On it, a name, Sayuri. "She's well," he said. "The nuns care for her. She's already asking questions no one can answer." Yuzuha covered her mouth. The man did not touch her, did not move closer. "I thought you should know," he said. Yuzuha turned away, tears running silently down her cheeks, not of sorrow, not even joy, but of release, as if something inside her tightly wound for so long had finally begun to loosen. That night she did not perform. She sat by the screen, holding the comb in her lap, watching the snow fall in soft spirals. For the first time in years she felt something shift, a quiet hope, not for escape, not yet, but for continuity. That her story, interrupted, buried, veiled, was still being written somewhere beyond the walls of Yoshiwara. Somewhere, a child with her eyes was looking up at the sky and wondering where the snow came from. And perhaps one day that child would follow the trail of her own name. Back to the woman who had once chosen silence, and who finally had been heard. Snow lingered along the narrow alleys of Yoshiwara like ash from a sacred fire, delicate, fading, reluctant to let go. Even in its most hushed season, the pleasure district never truly slept. There was always the rustle of silk, the murmur of lantern light against shoji screens, the quiet shuffle of getter on planks smoothed by centuries of desire. But for Yuzuha, this winter was different. She had learned how to breathe again. Not the shallow breath of performance, the slow exhale of practiced seduction, but the kind of breath that stretched beneath the ribs into places she'd forgotten existed. She was careful to keep it hidden. Joy in a place like this was dangerous. Even Kiku, who had watched over her like a shadow stitched to her feet, noticed the subtle changes. The way Yuzuha's gaze lingered longer on the moon. How her voice, once dulled by routine, had taken on a softness again, like river water curling around stones. It had been weeks since the man, the silent visitor, had last come. She didn't know his name. He'd never offered it. And perhaps that was best. He had arrived like a wind from the north, brief, bracing, and gone before the curtains could fully part. But he had left a trail of warmth behind. A comb, a name, a confirmation that her daughter breathed under the same sky. Sayuri. Yuzuha whispered it sometimes at night while brushing her hair, like a charm, a promise, a thread between worlds. The brothel, however, did not pause for sentiment. Madame Junko, ever vigilant, began assigning her to higher-paying clients again, wealthy merchants from Osaka, a foreign trader's translator with eyes the color of rust, a samurai whose robes smelled faintly of blood and pine. Each encounter was measured, controlled. Yuzuha played her part well, but behind the painted smile, her mind wandered, to the tiny temple garden, to a child chasing birds among the mossy stones, to the way a silver bell might chime when small hands brushed against it. One morning, as the district prepared for New Year celebrations, Kiku brought news. Another girl, Sumi, a junior courtesan with bright cheeks and quick hands, had collapsed during her evening walk. It was a quiet fall, no drama, no fuss, but those who knew understood. She was with child. Yuzuha's stomach knotted, not from judgment, but memory. Madame Junko, ever swift, acted before rumours could grow. Sumi was declared ill, removed from the calendar and sent to recover in one of the back chambers, the ones with thick walls and heavy doors. Yuzuha waited until the moon was high before she slipped out of her room. Kiku followed silently, not needing to be told. They found Sumi curled beneath a thin blanket, her hair undone, her face blotched with fever. She tried the teas, Kiku whispered. Didn't work. Yuzuha sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's damp forehead. Sumi opened her eyes slowly. "Is it true?" she asked. "That you—" She didn't finish. Yuzuha didn't answer, only took her hand and pressed it lightly. "There's a woman," she said softly. "Her name is Midori." Kiku nodded. She knew what needed to be done. The next day, Kiku slipped out once more, this time with an extra bundle of coins from Yuzuha's own store. Helping Sumi felt like closing a circle, like returning a favor never repaid. But it was more than that. It was rebellion, quiet, dangerous, necessary. Courtesans were not allowed to help each other. Not truly. Rivalries were cultivated, whispers encouraged. A fractured house was a profitable one. But Yuzuha had begun to imagine something different. Not escape, not yet, but resistance, a sisterhood behind the silks, a network of whispers, of hands held in the dark. When Midori arrived, she did not speak, only glanced at Yuzuha with a flicker of recognition. A shared memory passed between them. Pain, birth, silence, survival. Yuzuha offered her tea. Midori declined. She never stayed long. Sumi recovered. The baby did not. There was no ceremony, no funeral. Only a bundle wrapped in indigo cloth, placed gently beneath the roots of an old plum tree in the temple yard. Sumi wept once, then did not speak of it again. The next week she returned to duty. No one noticed the change in her eyes, except Yuzuha. That night, Yuzuha lit a stick of incense and placed it beside her mirror. She did not pray, but she remembered, and remembering in Yoshiwara was its own form of rebellion. The weeks passed. Clients came and went. Some left poems, others left bruises, none left a name. The silver comb remained hidden beneath her pillow, a talisman. Then, on the first night of plum blossoms, a letter arrived, folded in the shape of a crane, tied with red thread. Inside, a name, a date, a location. Sayuri was to be moved. Another orphanage. Further inland. The temple had fallen on hard times. Donations were dwindling. The nuns aging. Yuzuha read the letter 10 times before she moved. She packed nothing, took only the comb and a small bundle of coins. When Kiku asked, she didn't explain. She only touched the younger woman's shoulder and whispered, "I have to see her." Kiku didn't argue. At dawn, Yuzuha slipped through the gate, her face hidden beneath a travelling veil. She walked for hours, past the red torii gates and the rice fields, past the low chants of mourning monks. She reached the temple just as the sun crested over the hills. And there, among the plum trees, was Sayuri, smaller than she'd imagined. Dark hair tied in uneven pigtails, a smudge of ink on one cheek. She was playing with a wooden toy, her laugh clear and high. Yuzuha didn't move, didn't speak. She only stood at the edge of the garden, hidden behind the wall of flowering branches, watching. Watching as the child turned toward the breeze, lifted her face to the sky, and smiled. The same smile. Yuzuha covered her mouth. She stayed until the bell rang for morning prayers. Then she turned, walked away, and did not look back. But something had changed. She had seen, and that sight would carry her through the long nights ahead. When Yuzuha returned to Yoshiwara, the air felt heavier. Not just with the spring dampness that clung to the edges of the rooftops or the scent of plum blossoms pressed into the folds of robes. No, it was something deeper, a thickness in the chest, a quiet weight that settled over everything she did. She had glimpsed a world outside the brocade curtain, a moment of softness that no amount of training could erase. But in the pleasure quarters, softness was dangerous. The madam noticed first. Junko, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, called her into the office on the second morning after her return. The room was lined with scrolls and record books, the faint trace of incense curling upward from a cracked ceramic bowl. Junko sat behind her lacquered desk, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "You were gone 2 days." Yuzuha bowed. "I had business." Junko's expression didn't change. Business that required you to disappear without notice. "I needed time," Yuzuha said softly, "to remember something I had forgotten." That gave Junko pause. She didn't ask more. Instead, she opened one of the books and slid it forward. A list of names, clients, prices, dates. "You're behind," she said. 3 appointments missed. 2 very important patrons left disappointed. "I'll make it up." "You will," Junko said, and her voice was not unkind. "But not by charming poetry lovers and dreamers. Tonight, you will receive Lord Hasegawa." Yuzuha's hands clenched beneath her sleeves. Lord Hasegawa was not a kind man. He was powerful, wealthy, known for his influence over the city magistrate, and equally known for the sharp edge of his desires. He liked obedience, silence, control. There had been rumors. One courtesan had emerged with bruises, another had disappeared entirely, but refusal was not an option, not here. Yuzuha bowed again. "As you wish." That evening she dressed carefully, not in her usual crimson, but in deep indigo, with a pattern of falling leaves embroidered along the hem. Her hair was arranged higher than usual, each pin secured like armor. Her lips, painted a shade darker than the fashion of the season, curled into something that resembled a smile. When Lord Hasegawa entered, he did not speak. He only looked at her, slowly, like a man surveying something he already owned. He poured the first cup of sake himself, an unusual gesture, and offered it to her. "Drink." Yuzuha accepted, her fingers steady. Her eyes did not leave his. The sake burned. He spoke little during the first hour, only watched as she played the shamisen, sang the old songs. His eyes never blinked, as if absorbing every note, every gesture. When she laughed, he did not. When she paused, he did not fill the silence. Finally, he stood. "Remove your hairpins," he said. Her smile remained. "May I pour you another cup, my lord?" He stepped forward. "I said," the sound came sharp, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached slowly for the first pin, a long silver one. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then gently placed it on the lacquered tray beside her. The second pin followed, then the third. Her hair began to loosen, falling around her shoulders like dark water. Hasegawa reached for her wrist. She pulled back. Just slightly. "My lord," she said, voice soft, "you are bruising the skin you admire." He froze. The words were polite, almost demure. But the undertone, calm and cold, hung in the air like steel. Something flickered in his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not with mirth, but recognition. "You're older than you look," he said. "I'm older than I was," she replied. He released her wrist. The rest of the night passed in a strange calm. He asked no more of her, only sat, occasionally sipping his sake, eyes half-lidded. When dawn approached, he stood and left without a word. Junko said nothing the next day, but there was a small nod, barely perceptible, an acknowledgement. Yuzuha had held her ground. Not many could. That week, more letters arrived. One from a merchant requesting a private poem, another from a former client offering to buy out her contract. She declined both, because she had begun to notice something strange. The power she thought she had lost had shifted. It was no longer in her appearance or even her performance. It was in her presence, her restraint, the strength behind the softness. Other courtesans noticed too. They began to come to her in quiet moments. Not just for advice about makeup or which silk to wear, but for the other things, the hidden things. How do you say no without saying it? What do you do when they don't listen? Who do you trust with your truth? Yuzuha never gave clear answers. She listened, offered tea, told stories that didn't always seem relevant, but always were. And slowly the house changed. Not on the surface. The performances continued. The clients came. The money flowed. But underneath, a current had begun to shift. The girls began to look out for each other more. They whispered warnings about dangerous clients. They shared their remedies, their hiding places, their hopes. A secret web was forming, woven in the hours after midnight between bowls of tea and half-finished songs. And Yuzuha sat at the center of it, not as a queen, but as a keeper. Of memory, of pain, of possibility. Because once you've held your child's name in your hands, once you've walked beyond the gates and returned with your soul intact, you become something more than what they trained you to be. You become dangerous. And in Yoshiwara there was nothing more powerful than a courtesan who remembered who she truly was. By midsummer, the heat had settled over Yoshiwara like a silken shroud soaked in sweat. Fans flicked endlessly in every room. Servants carried bowls of shaved ice between chambers, dripping trails behind them like pale ghosts. The courtesans adapted as they always did. Lighter robes, thinner makeup, hair pinned higher to expose the nape of the neck, where men's eyes so often lingered. But the heat had a way of loosening more than just fabric. It loosened secrets. Whispers began to travel faster, words slipping from one room to another through paper walls and half-closed doors. And amidst the murmurs came a new name. Nakamura. A name not uttered with reverence or desire, but with fear. He was not a lord, not a merchant, not a man of literature or manners. He had arrived in Edo from the north, bringing with him a small fortune and a reputation that no one dared verify. He did not frequent the pleasure houses to talk or admire. He came to dominate. His visits were swift and frequent. He left behind bruises, silence, and sometimes absence. One girl had vanished 2 weeks earlier, sent on retreat according to the madam's log, but no one believed that. Another had returned after 3 nights, unable to speak for days. Now he had requested Yuzuha. The madam called her in the morning. He insists. Yuzuha bowed, her face expressionless. Inside, something cold uncurled in her chest. That afternoon, she prepared herself not with beauty but with precision. She wore no ornaments in her hair. Her kimono was simple, a pattern of morning glories on pale blue, modest, almost plain. She placed nothing fragile in the room. No porcelain, no instruments, just tatami, a tray of sake, and her own stillness. When Nakamura arrived, she felt the temperature in the room drop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a carved statue and eyes that never settled. He didn't bow. He didn't speak. He merely entered and shut the door behind him with a soft thud that seemed far too final. Yuzuha greeted him as she always did, with a smile, a cup of sake, and a slight inclination of her head. He ignored it. Instead, he stepped forward, fingers already reaching for the collar of her robe, and then paused. Because Yuzuha did not move. She did not flinch. She did not reach for his hand or lean away or offer a breathless laugh. She simply looked at him. Her eyes dark, calm, unwavering. It was not resistance, it was recognition, and that confused him. "You're not afraid," he said, his voice like gravel dragged across a lacquered floor. Yuzuha lifted the sake cup and offered it again. "I do not fear what I understand," she said. He narrowed his eyes. "Then you don't understand me at all." "Perhaps." She placed the cup down. "But I understand this room, and I understand silence, and I understand pain." She stepped back, just slightly. "I also understand that men who raise their hands are often men who were never truly seen." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not a kind laugh, not even amused, but startled. "Who are you?" Yuzuha tilted her head. "No one." That seemed to satisfy him. He did not touch her that night. He drank in silence and left just before dawn. The next morning, Kiku found Yuzuha sitting at her mirror, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. "He didn't stay long," Kiku said carefully. "No," Yuzuha replied. "You're not hurt?" "No." Kiku hesitated, then asked, "What did you say to him?" Yuzuha met her gaze in the mirror. "I gave him nothing." That day, the brothel was unusually quiet. Girls passed one another with knowing glances, speaking in gestures rather than words. By evening, word had spread. Nakamura had left the city. No one knew why. No explanation was offered. But Yuzuha knew. Sometimes silence was a sword. Sometimes the refusal to flinch was more powerful than any scream. After that, something changed in the way the girls looked at her. It was not just respect now, it was hope. The youngest ones began leaving folded notes by her door, questions, confessions, drawings of distant towns. One girl asked how to fake illness convincingly. Another asked where to hide money. One simply wrote, "Do you ever forget their faces?" Yuzuha read every note. She answered few, but she kept them all, wrapped in a cloth bundle beneath her futon. Late at night, she would unfold them one by one, her fingers moving slowly over the inked lines. She would whisper their names, real or invented, into the darkness, as if anchoring them to something larger than the district walls. One evening, she received a visitor who brought no sake, no gifts, no coin. It was Midori. She entered quietly, her face more drawn than usual. "There's a girl," she said without preamble. "Not far from here. Too young, too scared." Yuzuha nodded. "I'll come." And so began another quiet ritual. Once a week, Yuzuha left the pleasure district at dawn, her face hidden beneath a travelling hood, and walked with Midori to wherever she was needed. Not to heal always, but to hold, to listen, to teach what could not be spoken aloud inside the okiya. The girls trusted her, even the ones who didn't know her name. They recognized something in her silence, a kind of permission to survive, to imagine a way through. And as Yuzuha sat in their dim rooms, placing her hand gently over their trembling ones, she realized that the walls of Yoshiwara were not as solid as they seemed. They could be breached, not by fire, but by memory, by kindness passed in secret, by the invisible thread stretching between one woman's story and another's heartbeat, a thread not even time could sever. Rain came early that year. By the second week of the 5th month, the air had turned to mist. Not the gentle kind that softened edges and made lanterns glow with mystery, but a thick, heavy dampness that sank into the skin and refused to leave. The smell of wet tatami, of camphor and mildew, haunted the corners of every chamber in the okiya. The courtesans dabbed their sleeves with dried citrus peel, hoping to mask the scent, but even the most expensive incense couldn't keep the season out. In the midst of this soggy silence, a new girl arrived. Her name was Anzu. She couldn't have been more than 13. Her face was still round with childhood, her fingers small, her ankles unsteady in raised sandals. But she walked with the careful stillness of someone who had been watching women her whole life, studying how they moved, how they paused, how they made beauty from breath. She was not yet a courtesan, not even a Shinzo. She had just been bought from a rural family 3 provinces over. Her contract still smelled of ink and rice paper. Yuzuha saw her first during the morning garden walk. Anzu stood beside the plum tree, arms tucked inside her sleeves, eyes lowered. She did not look up, even when a sparrow landed a foot away from her on the moss. "She hasn't spoken since she arrived," Kiku whispered later that day. "Not a word." Yuzuha nodded. She had seen it before. Girls folded into silence like paper cranes, their voices hidden deep beneath the weight of what they had left behind. That night, Yuzuha brought a small bowl of warm rice porridge to the girls' room. The door slid open without a sound. Anzu sat on the floor, knees drawn up, back perfectly straight. "I brought this," Yuzuha said softly. Anzu did not move. Yuzuha placed the bowl down, careful not to disturb the quiet, and sat across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The rain tapped gently at the wooden eaves above. Finally, Yuzuha said, "When I first arrived here, I thought silence would protect me, that if I stayed still enough, no one would notice how scared I was." She looked at the girl, whose eyes remained fixed on the floor. "But I learned that silence isn't always protection. Sometimes it's just a cage." Still no response. Yuzuha smiled faintly. "When you're ready, I'll teach you how to open it." She stood, leaving the bowl behind, and slid the door shut without another word. The next morning, the bowl was empty. And 2 nights later, Anzu spoke. Only one word. "Why?" Yuzuha turned slowly, surprised by the small voice behind her. Anzu stood in the hall, her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of her sleeve. "Why are you kind to me?" Yuzuha stepped forward, kneeling so their eyes met. "Because someone once was, when I thought no one would be." Anzu blinked rapidly. Her eyes shimmered. "Will it hurt?" she asked. There was no need to clarify. Yuzuha took a long breath. "Yes," she said, "but not all at once, and not forever." Anzu's lip trembled. I don't want to be beautiful. Yuzuha felt something sharp twist in her chest. You don't have to be, she whispered. Not here, not with me. In the days that followed, Anzu shadowed Yuzuha like a quiet breeze. She fetched her brushes, arranged her combs, refilled the water basin with care. But more than that, she listened. Every gesture Yuzuha made, how she folded her robe, how she stirred her tea, was absorbed with reverence. The other girls began to notice. She's taking a liking to you, one of them said with a sly smile. She reminds me of someone, Yuzuha replied. Of herself. Before the hairpins, before Sayuri, before she had learned how to bear the weight of others' gazes. One evening, while Yuzuha braided her hair by lamplight, Anzu asked, Is it true that if we save enough, we can buy our freedom? Yuzuha didn't answer right away. She tied the end of the braid carefully, then met the girl's eyes in the mirror. Yes, but they make it very hard. How much? Enough to rebuild your whole life. Have you saved enough? Not yet. Anzu frowned. Will you run when you do? Yuzuha smiled. No, I will walk. That night she unwrapped her cloth bundle of secret notes and added a new one. Just a name. Folded, placed beneath the others. Held close. Because the girl was already changing. Not into what the house wanted her to be, but into something more dangerous. Someone who could imagine a life beyond it. Yuzuha taught her how to move without drawing attention, how to memorize patterns on the tatami so she always knew where footsteps had paused, how to fake sleep, how to cry without sound, how to smile with her eyes while thinking of something else entirely. She taught her how to endure without disappearing. And slowly, Anzu began to bloom, not in the way the clients would one day demand, but in strength, in certainty. She began leaving notes of her own. Where did you learn that song? Do you think I'll forget my mother's voice? Do they ever stop seeing us as mirrors? Yuzuha answered only one. She wrote it carefully and left it under the girl's pillow. They stop seeing you as a mirror the day you stop reflecting what they want. Spring faded into early summer. The air grew thick again. Lanterns swayed beneath the weight of humidity and the garden filled with dragonflies. Anzu, now dressed in apprentice silks, followed Yuzuha to her appointments. Not to serve, but to observe, to learn. But she carried more than trays now. She carried a kind of quiet fire. And Yuzuha, watching her from across a room, realized she had done more than protect the girl. She had passed something on, a legacy not of makeup or manners, but of resistance, of memory, of the courage to name what they had all been trained to forget. And that would outlast even the strongest perfume. The heat reached its peak by the 7th month. Cicadas droned endlessly from the pine trees beyond the walls, their cry sharp and maddening. Inside the okia, the air was thick with humidity, clinging to the walls, soaking into robes, rusting the hinges of drawers. The courtesans moved more slowly now, fanning themselves between clients, resting damp cloths along their necks, smiling through the discomfort like porcelain dolls in a kiln. It was the season of endurance, and it was during this breathless summer that a letter arrived, sealed with wax, no emblem. Delivered not by a courier in uniform, but by a boy no older than 10, his sleeves torn and his sandals covered in road dust. He offered the scroll to the house attendant, bowed once, and vanished. Madame Junko opened it in the common hall, her spectacles low on her nose. She read the words once, then twice, and then called for Yuzuha. The hall quieted as she entered. Junko handed her the scroll without speaking. The ink was bold, written in a practiced, unfamiliar hand, and yet the name at the end sent a pulse through her chest. Ray, the man who had once brought her the silver comb, who had stood in her room and said her daughter's name aloud for the first time, the man whose silence had softened her armor more deeply than any flattery ever could. The letter was simple. There had been a fire. The temple where Sayuri lived was damaged. No lives lost, but many of the children had been moved, some sent to distant provinces, others absorbed into different temples across the region. Sayuri, he wrote, had been taken in by a woman named Hanae, a former nun now living in a quiet village along the coast. She was safe, but remote. Then, a final line, she asked if the comb was a gift from her mother. Yuzuha read that sentence again and again. She felt her body grow still, as if time had thickened around her. Sayuri remembered the comb. She remembered. After years of trying not to imagine her daughter's voice or face too clearly, after years of folding her memory tightly so it wouldn't unravel her from the inside. Now Yuzuha found herself undone by a single question. A simple, fragile curiosity from a child who had only seen her mother once, from behind a wall of plum blossoms. That night, she sat by her mirror and lit 3 candles. One for Sayuri, one for Anzu, asleep in the next room, and one for all the names she had folded into the cloth bundle beneath her floorboard. She whispered their names as each wick danced, and then she made a decision. She would go, not to take Sayuri back. No, that life had passed. But to see her again, to make sure she was truly safe, to hear her speak, even if only from a distance. But leaving Yoshiwara even for a day was no simple thing. Contracts were iron-bound, movement watched, excuses scrutinized. So she began to prepare, carefully, quietly. Each day she deposited an extra coin from her earnings into a separate pouch, one not recorded in the house ledgers. Each night she mapped a route in her mind, which gate was least guarded, which lanterns flickered out first, what time the watchman grew drowsy from sake. And she confided in only one person, Anzu. The girl listened without blinking. "You'll be punished if they find out," she whispered. Yuzuha nodded. "I know." "Will you come back?" "I don't know." Anzu looked down. Her hands were shaking. Yuzuha reached out, took them in her own. "You're ready," she said gently. "More than you think." Anzu didn't respond, but she didn't look away. The day came quietly. A heavy rain fell that morning, veiling the district in mist. Yuzuha dressed not in finery, but in a traveller's kimono, plain and brown, her hair tied low beneath a faded scarf. She tucked the silver comb into her sleeve. Just before dawn, she slipped through the back gate, barefoot, sandals in hand. The street was silent. Only the rain spoke. She walked quickly, keeping to the alleys, past shuttered tea-houses and empty courtyards. She did not look back, not even once. By midday, she had reached the outskirts of Edo. The air smelled of wet earth and bamboo. The noise of the city faded into birdsong and wind. She rode in a merchant's cart for part of the way, offering coin, but no name. The driver did not ask questions. She imagined he saw many women with untold stories heading toward villages where no one asked where they came from. By the time she reached the coast, 3 days had passed. The village was smaller than she expected. Thatched roofs, a temple bell that rang only once a day. Children running barefoot along dirt paths, their laughter carrying through the sea breeze. She asked for Hanai. The name was known. A boy pointed toward a small house near the edge of the cliff, where the ocean curved like a broken bowl. Yuzuha walked slowly. Her heart, strangely, was quiet. Not expectant, not afraid, just full. She saw the house. A line of drying herbs hung above the door. A wooden wind chime swayed in the salt air, and there, on the step, sat a girl. 8 years old, maybe 9. Her hair was shorter now. She wore a plain cotton robe. Her cheeks were round, her hands dusty with earth. She was drawing in the dirt with a stick, and beside her, tucked carefully into the belt of her robe, was the silver comb. Yuzuha stopped. She didn't speak. She didn't move. The girl didn't look up. She just kept drawing, tongue between her teeth, tracing the outline of a bird in flight, a shape Yuzuha knew by heart. Then, without turning, the girl said softly, "I remember you." Yuzuha's breath caught. The wind shifted. Sayuri looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. But in that moment, across the silence, something passed between them. Not recognition, not explanation, but something older, something sacred, a knowing. Sayuri smiled, just a little, a flicker. And Yuzuha finally allowed herself to cry, quietly, fully, without fear of being seen, because she had been, at last. Yuzuha stayed by the coast for 3 nights. Not in Hanai's home, though she had been offered a bed there. She chose instead the small guest room in the back of the temple near the village's edge, where the floor smelled of cedar and the sea breeze drifted through cracks in the wooden shutters. The monks said little, their faces weathered by wind and habit. One brought her tea each morning, another left rice balls and pickled plum at her door without knocking. She asked for nothing, said almost nothing. She spent most of the daylight hours walking. Not with Sayuri, no. That would have broken the delicate thread of what they now shared. Yuzuha kept a respectful distance, observing from behind clusters of pines through the low hum of summer insects. But every morning, just after sunrise, Sayuri would appear barefoot outside Hanai's garden gate, carrying a basket, or a wooden toy, or a book with frayed corners. She played alone. or with the other village children when they came. She laughed loudly when a goat chased her across the path. She argued with a boy over the correct way to fold a paper frog. She napped once beneath a tree, hand curled loosely around a fallen peach blossom, and always, tucked into her obi, was the silver comb. On the third evening, Yuzuha returned to the garden path just before dusk. Sayuri was kneeling by a row of potted herbs, plucking mint leaves with careful fingers. She looked up before Yuzuha could speak. "You walk like rain," she said matter-of-factly. Yuzuha smiled. "I do?" Sayuri nodded, quiet but always coming closer. Yuzuha stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside her. "I used to walk faster," she said. "I don't think you need to." Sayuri held out a mint leaf. Yuzuha accepted it, pressing it between her palms to release its scent. The fragrance rose like memory, sharp, clean, green. "Do you know what your name means?" she asked softly. Sayuri nodded. "Little Lily. My mother gave it to me." Yuzuha's throat tightened. She had a garden? No, she had a dream. They sat in silence, the sky above them turning from gold to soft lavender. The waves beyond the cliff made a low sound, steady as breathing. "Are you staying here forever?" Sayuri asked. Yuzuha looked down. "No, I can't." "Why?" "Because the world I live in is not made for forever." Sayuri didn't reply. She only plucked another mint leaf and folded it in half. Then again until it was a tiny green square. She placed it in Yuzuha's hand and closed her fingers around it. "Take it with you." Yuzuha nodded. A minute passed, maybe two. Then Sayuri spoke again, but this time more quietly. "Will you come back?" "I don't know." Sayuri turned her face to the horizon, where the last light was slipping beneath the sea's edge. "That's okay," she said, "but if I don't see you again, I'll remember anyway." And with that, she stood, dusted her hands, and returned to the house. Yuzuha remained on the path, the mint leaf still in her palm, her heart full of something she could not name. Not sorrow, not longing, but a kind of recognition, a fullness that pulsed without ache. She left the village before dawn the next morning. No one saw her go. The road back to Edo felt shorter, as if her footsteps were lighter now. She moved like a woman who had laid something down, not like a woman who had left something behind. And yet, as she neared the gates of Yoshiwara, she hesitated. The paper lanterns were still dim from the night. A breeze stirred the banners over the brothel entrances. Already, the sound of shamisen tuning, the scent of fish broth and boiled barley in the morning kitchens. It was all unchanged. Utterly the same. Yuzuha stepped through the gate and let the silence embrace her like an old cloak. Inside, the rooms greeted her with their familiar quiet. Kiku was waiting, eyes wide, face pale with the worry of someone who had not truly slept in 3 nights. "I didn't know if you—" "I'm here," Yuzuha whispered. That was enough. Later that evening she returned to her room. Anzu was waiting. She stood as Yuzuha entered but didn't speak. Her eyes searched Yuzuha's face like a map, looking for signs of loss or joy or both. Yuzuha crossed the room and handed her something, a folded mint leaf. "This," she said, "was given to me by someone who believes in remembering." Anzu took it gently, cradling it in her palm. Then she asked, "Are you leaving again?" "Not yet." "Someday?" Yuzuha gave a small smile. "Someday." And with that, the room returned to silence. But not the heavy kind, not the silence of secrets or shame. This was a silence of stories passed down without words, of lessons folded into leaves, of a mother who could not stay, but who had been seen, and of a child who had not been kept, but who had been known. That night, Yuzuha did not light her mirror candles. She sat by the screen, combing her hair beneath the glow of the moon, the scent of mint still clinging to her fingers. Outside, the cicadas cried louder than ever, but inside there was only peace. Autumn crept into Yoshiwara without ceremony. It arrived not with a sudden chill, but with the slow fading of things, of colours, of songs, of light at the corners of each day. The red silk lanterns that once seemed vibrant now looked a shade duller. The voices in the tea-houses dropped a pitch lower. Even the perfume that clung to the courtesans' sleeves seemed fainter, as if diluted by the season. Yuzuha felt the shift in her bones. Not just from age, though 24 in the pleasure district was already a quiet warning, but from everything she had carried and unspokenly passed on. Each step across the Okiya's wooden floor now echoed with the weight of memory. Her every movement had a stillness to it, as though it were steeped in meaning even when nothing was said. She noticed too that fewer men asked for her now. Not because she had lost her beauty, no, that lingered like the aftertaste of sweet sake, but because beauty alone was never what they came for. They came for illusion, for innocence dressed in knowing, for a mirror that didn't reflect their aging eyes. And Yuzuha no longer played that part. She had changed. The ones who visited her now were quieter, more respectful, sometimes even fearful. They sensed something in her they couldn't name, a woman who had walked to the edge of herself and returned. A courtesan whose gaze no longer asked for permission. One evening, after a long rain, she sat in the garden courtyard, listening to the drip of water from the eaves. Anzu appeared beside her, wordless, and knelt without speaking. The girl had grown. She wore apprentice silks now, the soft plum colour of the shinzo, her hair styled simply but elegantly. Her eyes had lost their frantic shimmer. In their place was calm. "I want to tell you something," Anzu said. Yuzuha turned her head slightly. "I'm listening. I've been offered my first patron." The words hung between them like incense smoke. Yuzuha's hands stilled. "Do you want him?" Anzu hesitated. "He's kind. He brings me oranges, and he doesn't stare. But do you want him? I don't know yet." "That's your answer." Anzu looked down. "They say I should accept. They will always say what you should do," Yuzuha replied. "But you are not here to be obedient. You are here to survive." Anzu's voice was quieter now. "How did you know when to say yes?" "I didn't," Yuzuha said. "I just knew when to stop saying no." The wind stirred the leaves in the courtyard. A pale moth fluttered by, brushing against the edge of Yuzuha's robe. "You've changed," Anzu said softly. "I've remembered." "What?" "Myself." The next day, a note arrived from Madame Junko. It was brief. A patron of great wealth, recently arrived from the west of Kyoto, had asked specifically for Yuzuha. He had heard of her through unnamed channels. He was offering triple her usual fee. It would be a discreet engagement. One night only. Yuzuha stared at the parchment, and for the first time in her life, she said no. She wrote it plainly. "Thank you for the offer, but I will not accept." She handed the letter to Kiku, who blinked once before nodding and disappearing down the hall. No arguments were made. No punishment followed. Later that night, Madame Junko appeared at her door. No makeup, no formality, just the woman beneath the lacquer. "I knew you'd do this eventually," she said, sitting without being asked. Yuzuha poured her tea, the same routine they had followed for years, but this time it felt like a farewell. "You're not angry?" Yuzuha asked. Junko shook her head. "No, just aware." "Of what?" "That your time here is nearly over." They drank in silence for a while. Junko spoke again. "I was like you once, before I became the madam." Yuzuha glanced at her. "I've never heard your story." "No one asks," Junko said with a faint smile. "I'm asking now." But Junko only shook her head. Another time. She stood, smoothing her robe. "When the time comes, Yuzuha, you won't need permission. Just go." And with that, she left. For hours afterward, Yuzuha sat alone, the tea gone cold in her cup, the room filled with the slow shifting of memories. She thought of Sayuri, of her little folded mint leaf, of the way Anzu had begun to take up space, no longer asking how but when, and she knew. The walls of Yoshiwara no longer held her. They had taught her how to live inside them, but they had also, unknowingly, taught her how to walk beyond them. She was no longer a courtesan pretending to be free. She was a woman who had already tasted freedom, and now could never forget its shape. And autumn, with its fading light and cool winds, was not a time for endings. It was a time for preparation, for shedding what no longer served, for gathering strength beneath the skin, because winter would come, and with it, the moment to step into the snow and not look back. The first frost came quietly, not with drama or sudden cold, but with a delicate film of silver dusting the tops of the garden stones. The maple leaves had already turned, their crimson and gold spilling across the inner courtyard like forgotten kimono silk. The koi in the pond moved more slowly now, their once erratic turns replaced by gentle gliding arcs, as if they too understood that this was the season to conserve, to wait. Inside the okiya, preparations for winter were underway. Woolen underlayers were brought from storage. The tatami were dried and beaten. Charcoal braziers were lit in the mornings, filling the rooms with a smoky warmth. The courtesans traded their light silks for heavier, richer fabrics, deep emeralds, indigos and blacks embroidered with threads of silver and rust. Yuzuha felt the shift, not only in her body, but in the very bones of the house. The quiet deepened. Everything slowed. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred. She began waking before dawn, long before the house did. She would wrap herself in a plain shawl and sit by the paper screens, watching as the first grey light bled into the sky. Her mind wandered now more than ever, to Sayuri, to the sea, to the sound of the wind on the path that led away from this life. She had not yet left, but she was no longer here. The girls could sense it. Anzu most of all. "You look like someone who already said goodbye," she murmured one morning, as she combed Yuzuha's hair in careful strokes. "Maybe I have," Yuzuha replied, just not aloud. Kiku, too, had noticed the change. She brought less tea, asked fewer questions, but her eyes lingered longer when she looked at Yuzuha, as if memorizing her face for a time when it would no longer be there in the hallway, passing like a shadow between chambers. Then, on the second morning of frost, something unexpected arrived. A package. Unmarked, wrapped in indigo cloth, tied with a knot so precise it could only have come from someone who still believed in meaning. Yuzuha unfolded it slowly. Inside was a small wooden box, and within the box, nestled in soft rice paper, was a bundle of letters, each tied with a ribbon, each written in a hand she didn't recognize. They were addressed not to her, but to someone like her. Each letter began differently. To the woman I saw but never truly knew. To the courtesan who reminded me I once loved someone with a voice like wind. To the girl in the green robe who never smiled at me, and I now understand why. Dozens of them. Letters from former clients, from poets and merchants, from strangers who had once watched her from behind veils of sake and steam and lantern light. Letters written not in apology, she would not have accepted them, but in something closer to gratitude, or grief, or both. She read each one slowly, her breath catching not at the words themselves, but at what they represented. Proof. Proof that even in a world where she was expected to vanish without a trace, she had left echoes. One letter stood out. Its paper was older, the ink faded. To the woman who did not let me break her. I don't remember your name, only the silence, and how it taught me that I was smaller than I thought. I still carry that lesson. It burns less now. There was no signature, but Yuzuha knew who it had been. She closed the box gently and placed it beneath her pillow, not to hide it, but to sleep above it, to dream above it. To feel each night the quiet reassurance that her story had already rippled far beyond what she could see. Later that week, as the wind sharpened and the garden trees stood bare, Anzu came to her with a question. "Will you teach me how to leave?" Yuzuha looked up from her embroidery. "Why now?" "Because I saw you choose to stay, and I think it takes even more strength." Yuzuha set down the needle. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she gestured for Anzu to sit. Then she reached beneath the floorboard and retrieved the old cloth bundle. She opened it before the girl, letting the folded names and notes spill across the tatami. "This," she said, "is where leaving begins." Anzu picked up one of the papers. "What is it?" "Memory," Yuzuha said. "Yours, mine, theirs. It's what they cannot take." She gave the girl a small piece of parchment. "Write yours." Anzu hesitated, then slowly began to write. Yuzuha watched her, heart both heavy and lifted, because this was how it would happen, not with doors thrown open, not with grand declarations, but with one girl remembering her name, one woman writing her story down, one note folded and placed quietly beneath the floor, like a seed, waiting for spring, waiting to bloom. Snow came early that year. It began with a whisper, a few errant flakes drifting between the branches of the garden's bare persimmon tree. By the next morning, the rooftops of Yoshiwara had softened beneath a blanket of white. The brothel's wooden eaves, once streaked with soot and rain, now held silence in delicate folds. Footsteps became muffled. Lantern light seemed gentler, reflected in pale drifts that piled along the edges of the walkways. Inside the okiya, the courtesans huddled around charcoal braziers, their laughter softer, slower. Long evenings passed with the sound of shamisen and the clack of mahjong tiles. Even the clients, wrapped in winter silks and carried in palanquins through the snow, arrived in fewer numbers, their desire tempered by the cold. Yuzuha found herself drifting through the days like a figure inside a snow globe, watching everything, but no longer touched by it. The memory of her journey to the coast remained vivid yet distant. Sayuri's voice, soft and certain, still echoed in her mind. Some nights she imagined her daughter sitting by the same ocean, folding mint leaves, her breath fogging in the winter air. Other nights Yuzuha imagined herself walking there again, this time not returning. But something kept her tethered, not duty, not fear, but Anzu. The girl had begun to change, not suddenly, but in subtle ways, like a river freezing over. She asked fewer questions now, her gestures more precise. She walked with her chin higher, and when clients asked for her by name, she no longer hesitated. Yuzuha watched it happen with quiet grief. Anzu was becoming what she needed to be to survive here, and yet she had not forgotten. One evening, Anzu entered her room carrying a small parcel wrapped in mulberry paper. Without speaking, she knelt beside Yuzuha and placed it in her hands. Inside was a comb, simple, carved from dark wood, no lacquer, no ornaments, but smooth and warm to the touch as if it had been held often. "I made it," Anzu said. "There's a carpenter near the river. He let me use his tools." Yuzuha ran her fingers along the teeth of the comb. "It's beautiful. I wanted you to have something from me." Yuzuha looked up. "Why? In case you leave, or in case I do?" The brazier hissed softly beside them, a coal shifting beneath the ash. Yuzuha placed the comb in her sleeve. "Come with me tomorrow," she said. "I want to show you something." At dawn, before the others stirred, they slipped through the back garden, their footsteps crunching lightly in the snow. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was turning blue at the edges, like ink diluted in water. Yuzuha led Anzu to a small, forgotten corner of the outer courtyard. There, nestled beneath a weathered cedar tree, was a stone, flat, wide, nearly covered in frost. She knelt and brushed the snow aside, revealing names, not carved, not etched, but written in black ink, dozens of them, layered over the years, faded by rain and sun. Some had blurred into each other, others were still sharp, as if written only yesterday. "This is where I come," Yuzuha said, "when I need to remember that I am not alone." Anzu crouched beside her, tracing a finger over the damp stone. "Who are they? Girls like us, some gone, some still here. Some who never made it out." Anzu's lips parted slightly. "You wrote them? Not all. Some were here long before me." She reached into her sleeve and withdrew a fresh brush and inkstone. "Now you." Anzu looked uncertain. "What if I don't know what to write yet?" "Then just your name." Anzu took the brush with slow fingers, dipped it in the ink, and on the corner of the stone, between the names of two forgotten girls, she wrote her own. Anzu. The character was simple, graceful, a winter apricot. They sat there together until the light began to brighten, the wind slipping between the branches above, scattering snow onto their shoulders. Later that day, Yuzuha returned to her room to find another letter waiting. This one carried a symbol she hadn't seen in years, a crest once used by a retainer of a Kyoto house, embroidered onto the edge of an obi she wore only once. Inside, the message was short. A patron from the western provinces was seeking a companion, not for a night but for a season. He had lost a wife, had no children. He requested a woman of quiet strength, not for amusement, but for company. The price was generous, more than generous. It was enough to clear her contract, enough to walk free without owing a single mon. Yuzuha stared at the letter for a long time. She folded it slowly and placed it on her mirror table without decision. That night, she said nothing to anyone. But she lit 3 candles again, one for Sayuri, one for Anzu, and one for herself. Because choice, real choice, had returned to her, and for a woman of Yoshiwara, that was rarer than gold. Winter deepened, and with it came the stillness that only snow can bring. Each morning the Okiya woke to a world that had been hushed overnight. The usual clatter of carts and foot traffic from the outer streets had slowed to a mere whisper. The courtyards were blanketed in white so thick that no footsteps lingered more than a few hours before vanishing again. The lanterns burned longer into the day, their warm light flickering across frost-covered shoji screens. The smell of warm barley and miso filled the air. Inside, time seemed to stretch. Yuzuha moved through the season like someone in a dream, aware but no longer caught. The letter with the crest still sat untouched on her mirror table, its paper now slightly curled at the corners from the dry air. She did not rush toward it, nor did she ignore it. Instead, she treated it as a final quiet bell, one that rang not to summon her, but to remind her that the gate was open. She spoke of it to no one, not even Anzu, not even Kiku. But she began preparing, quietly. She gave away 3 of her most expensive hairpins to younger girls in the house, placing them in small folded cloths with no notes. She returned a borrowed brocade obi to the storeroom without being asked. She burned a stack of old poetry cards one by one, watching as each delicate phrase curled into black ash. And then one evening she retrieved the silver comb, the one Sayuri had kept tucked in her obi, the one that had once belonged to her mother, the comb that had crossed generations like a silent witness. She held it in her hand for a long time. Then, without ceremony, she wrapped it in silk and placed it in a box no bigger than her palm. That night, she called for Kiku. The attendant entered quietly, a towel still tucked under one arm from the evening's bath service. Yuzuha gestured for her to sit. "I need you to deliver something," she said softly. Kiku blinked. "To whom?" Yuzuha slid the box across the table. "To the temple, where she is." Kiku understood at once. She said nothing, only placed her hand over the box as if confirming that she would guard it with her life. Yuzuha watched her for a moment. "I won't be here much longer." Kiku met her gaze. There was no surprise in her face, only a sadness held so tightly that it hardened into strength. "I know," Kiku said. They didn't speak again, but the next morning the box was gone. That same day, Madame Junko summoned Yuzuha to her office. The room was cold, the brazier left unlit. A deliberate choice. Junko sat behind her usual lacquered desk, her robe thick, dark, formal. She did not ask about the letter. She only looked at Yuzuha with the same hard, clear eyes she had used the day they first met, so many years ago. "I knew you'd go," she said. Yuzuha bowed her head. "I waited to be sure." Junko nodded slowly. "You've earned enough to walk. More than enough. I made sure of it." Yuzuha looked up. "You did?" Junko exhaled, her breath clouding in the cold. "Not all girls waste their coins. You never did, and I took my share, yes, but I kept some aside." She opened a drawer, pulled out a cloth pouch and placed it on the table between them. "For the road." Yuzuha reached out but did not touch it. "Why?" Junko's mouth curled just slightly. "Because I'm tired of watching them all vanish." She turned away, eyes glinting. "And because you came back after you left. No one does that." Yuzuha picked up the pouch. It was heavier than she expected. They sat in silence for a while, the wind outside rattling faintly against the shutters. Then Junko spoke again. "When will you go?" "Soon." "Where?" "I don't know yet. Just not here." Junko nodded once, and that was the end of it. When Yuzuha stepped out into the hallway, Anzu was waiting. She stood by the wooden railing overlooking the inner garden, wrapped in a thick indigo shawl, her breath misting in the air. "You're leaving," she said. Yuzuha didn't deny it. Anzu turned toward her. "I thought I'd be afraid when this moment came." "And are you?" "No," Yuzuha smiled. "Good." Anzu looked away. "Can I ask one last thing? Anything. Take me with you." Yuzuha's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "Yes," the word came quickly, without tremor, with something stronger than certainty. Yuzuha stepped forward, placing her hands gently on Anzu's shoulders. "Then we'll go together." That night they didn't pack. They didn't say goodbye. They simply lit one candle and let it burn down to the base, watching as the last flame flickered and died. They slept side by side on a single futon, the air around them filled with the scent of cedar, ink, and something new. Hope, cold, quiet, and utterly alive. They left before the sun. Yuzuha and Anzu moved through the sleeping corridors like smoke, soft and untouchable. The halls of the Okiya, which had once held every sound like secrets cupped in cupped hands, now released them without resistance. Even the floorboards, so often creaking with memory, seemed to hold their breath. Anzu carried only a small bundle, 2 sets of robes, a pouch of tea leaves, and the comb Yuzuha had given her. Yuzuha's own satchel was only slightly larger. The cloth pouch Madame Junko had pressed into her hand days earlier now hung silently at her waist, tied twice, as if afraid to loosen too easily. Outside, the snow had crusted under the night wind. It cracked softly beneath their feet as they stepped into the narrow alley that wound behind the Okiya, the way servants and firewood came and went. The lanterns were still lit along the main path, their flames dulled by a thin layer of frost, casting an amber haze across the whitewashed earth. They said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The air stung their cheeks, not cruelly, but firmly, like a final touch from something that would never hold them again. As they passed the old cedar in the back courtyard, Yuzuha paused. Beneath it, the stone, half covered in snow. The names, hers among them, buried beneath a thin white veil. She didn't brush it clear. She didn't need to. She remembered. They continued walking, past the shuttered tea houses and quiet rooms, past the gate that once felt more like a spell than a threshold. The guard at the entrance was asleep, chin tucked into his robe, breath fogging the fur collar of his cloak. They didn't wake him. It wasn't necessary. No one chased women who didn't run. By the time they reached the outskirts of the district, the sky had begun to pale. First blue, then lavender, then the softest hue of peach. Yuzuha glanced back once. Just once. And saw it. Yoshiwara in winter. Still. Breathtaking. But no longer hers. She turned again and they walked on. The road into the hills was narrow and worn, traced with the prints of monks' merchants and the occasional pilgrim. Anzu's steps were light. She did not look behind her at all. Her eyes were fixed forward, as if chasing something she could already see. By mid-morning, they reached the village where the letter had first come from, the one with the symbol of the Western house. It was smaller than Yuzuha had imagined. The main road was lined with shuttered shops, and a small canal ran alongside, mostly frozen over. Children played in the slush, their laughter sharp against the winter silence. Yuzuha and Anzu passed among them like ghosts, unnoticed. They stopped at a tea house near the bridge. The old woman tending the kettle gave them each a small bowl of barley porridge and 2 roasted sweet potatoes wrapped in paper. "You're not from here," she said without judgment. "No," Yuzuha answered. But we answered. "But we won't stay long." The woman only nodded. No one stays anywhere long anymore. Later, they found lodging in a simple inn behind the shrine. The room was small but warm, the floor covered in thick straw mats, the window facing the hills. The innkeeper asked no questions. She only bowed and lit a single candle on the floor before leaving. Anzu sat near the window, her breath fogging the paper pane. "Do you know where we'll go next?" she asked. Yuzuha removed her scarf, loosened her outer robe, and knelt beside her. "No, but we don't have to decide yet." "I thought I'd be afraid." "You're not." Yuzuha watched her for a moment. "You've already lived through the worst part," she said gently, "becoming something you never chose." Anzu reached into her bundle and withdrew a folded paper. A name. Yuki. "I don't want to be Anzu anymore," she said. Yuzuha smiled. "Then you're not." The fire crackled in the small brazier. Outside, the snow began again, soft and steady, like breath. That night, Yuzuha wrote a letter, not to the patron in the western provinces, but to the temple by the sea. She told Sayuri what she could, that she had walked away, finally, that she was travelling, that she had met someone who reminded her that beginnings weren't just for the young. She did not say where she was going, only that she was moving forward, and that she carried Sayuri's name with her, always. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it into an envelope made of pale washi, then sealed it with wax melted from the very candle that lit her way out. Tomorrow they would walk again. But tonight she allowed herself something rare, rest. Not the sleep of exhaustion or forgetting, but the deep, warm stillness of someone who had finally, truly chosen. By the 5th morning they reached the edge of the pine forest. The road had narrowed into a trail now, one that curled along a low ridge above a frozen stream, its banks lined with twisted roots and ancient moss. The snow here was deeper, quieter. It swallowed their footsteps almost entirely, leaving only faint divots behind them that disappeared with the next gust of wind. There were no houses, no carts, no voices, just wind through needles and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Yuki, no longer Anzu, walked ahead of Yuzuha, her pace steady, her spine straight, her breaths visible but not rushed. The transition had taken hold more quickly than either of them expected. Once she had spoken the name, it had begun to shape her, like warm water poured into a chilled bowl. It spread through her posture, her tone, even her silence. There was no more nervous glancing, no more hesitation in her fingers. She was no longer a girl fleeing something. She was someone walking towards something she hadn't yet named. Yuzuha followed with quiet pride. Her own body was slower now, not from age, but from the layered exhaustion of years that had lived too heavily in the skin. She did not show it, not in her face, not in her breath. But with each step through the forest, she felt the pull, gentle but insistent, of time calling her inward. They made camp beneath a bent cedar whose branches shielded the snow. The ground was firm and dry there. Yuki built the fire with surprising speed, striking flint as if she'd done it all her life. Yuzuha watched her for a long time before finally speaking. "You've done this before." "No," Yuki said, not looking up. "But I watched a girl once who did. She ran away, into the forest beyond Yoshiwara. They said she froze to death before morning." "And did she?" Yuki looked over her shoulder. "No, she made it to a village. They found her selling hairpins 2 years later in the northern markets." Yuzuha smiled. "Good." They didn't need many words. Silence stretched comfortably between them now, like old fabric, worn but warm. As the fire crackled, Yuzuha removed a folded square of cloth from her sleeve. Inside it was the last of the notes, the ones she hadn't burned or buried. The ones written by girls who had whispered their truths to her when they thought no one else would listen. Some were stained with tears, others with rouge or candle wax or even a faint trace of perfume. She placed the bundle near the fire. Yuki reached forward but didn't touch. "Will you burn them?" "No," Yuzuha said. "They're not meant to disappear." She picked up a flat stone from the edge of the fire pit and began to place the folded papers beneath it, one by one. "What are you doing?" Yuki asked. "Leaving a record. Won't the snow destroy them?" "Maybe, but someone might find them first." "And if they don't?" Yuzuha paused, her fingers brushing lightly over the final note. "Then the earth will hold them." They sat in silence as the fire dwindled into coals. In the dark, the pines swayed like dancers, too slow for song. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Yuki spoke again. "Do you think the others made it out?" "Some. And the rest?" "They left pieces of themselves behind. That's a kind of escape, too." Yuki leaned back against her bedroll, staring up through the black web of branches. "I still dream of the hallway," she whispered. "The scent of the lacquer, the paper screens, that heavy quiet before the doors opened." Yuzuha nodded. "It will fade." "But not completely?" "No, you wouldn't want it to." Yuki closed her eyes. "Why not? Because remembering is how we carry the ones who couldn't leave." They slept in shifts that night, one tending the fire, the other curled beneath the cloak of silence and cold. The forest held them without malice, without welcome, just presence. As if to say, "You are here now, and that is enough." When morning came, it brought the softest kind of snow. Not a storm, not a blizzard. Just a steady, whispering fall that wrapped the world in white again, like a fresh page waiting to be written upon. Yuzuha rose slowly. Her joints ached, but there was clarity in her breath. She walked to the stream's edge and washed her hands in the freezing water, gasping once sharply, as if to remind herself she was still alive. Yuki stood behind her, arms folded. "There's a path west, past the hills. I think it leads to a valley." "Have you heard of it?" "No," she said, "but I want to." Yuzuha smiled. "That's reason enough." They packed in silence, checked their boots and scattered the coals with ash and snow. Before leaving, Yuzuha knelt beside the buried notes. She placed one more slip of parchment into the stone's shelter. Blank, no name, no word, just space. For whoever came next. Then they turned west toward the hills and kept walking. The valley found them before they expected it. By late afternoon, the pine forest began to thin. The trees grew shorter, more widely spaced, and patches of moss-covered rock peeked through the snow like old bones. Then, suddenly, the world opened. A wide, sweeping basin cradled by low hills, all dusted white under a pale blue sky. A river snaked through the middle, mostly frozen, its current visible only in thin lines of dark water that ran like ink beneath the surface. Yuki stopped at the ridge and drew a long breath. Her cheeks were red from the wind, her braids streaked with frost. She didn't speak. Yuzuha stepped beside her, eyes narrowed against the sun's low glare. There was a village at the heart of the valley, small, modest. A scatter of thatched rooftops, a narrow main road, and fields that would sleep until spring. Thin columns of smoke curled upward, steady and fragrant. A bell rang in the distance, sharp and clear, calling for evening prayers or perhaps supper. "We'll rest here," Yuzuha said softly. Yuki nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the rooftops. As they descended into the valley, the wind grew warmer, only slightly, but enough to feel like a change, a letting go. Their boots crunched softly over frozen brush and dried grass. Dogs barked once, then fell silent. A man stacking wood outside a shed looked up as they passed, but said nothing. They reached the village inn just before dusk. It was small, 3 rooms, a kitchen, and a tiny stable tucked behind an old persimmon tree. The innkeeper, a stooped woman with eyes like polished river stones, greeted them without surprise. Travellers, even women travelling alone, were not unheard of in the hills, especially in winter, when roads closed behind avalanches or washed out bridges. "You've walked far," the innkeeper said as she ladled hot miso into their bowls. "We're not finished walking," Yuzuha replied. "Few ever are." That night, Yuzuha soaked in the wooden bath behind the inn. Steam curled up into the freezing air and the stars blinked down without judgment. She scrubbed her skin slowly, carefully, removing not just the dirt of the trail but the weight of other years. Layers she hadn't known were still clinging. Inside, Yuki sat by the brazier in their room, drying her sleeves. She stared at the fire, expressionless. When Yuzuha returned, Yuki looked up. "Do you think this could be home?" she asked. Yuzuha hesitated. "I don't know. I think I want to stay, for a little while." Yuzuha sat beside her. "Then we will." For the first time since they had left Yoshiwara, they allowed themselves the idea of stillness. In the days that followed, they settled, not fully, but enough. Yuki helped with the morning deliveries from the rice storehouse, her sleeves tied back, her hands red from cold, but never trembling. She learned the names of the shopkeepers and the temple cat and the old man who sold pickled burdock root from a cart that squeaked when it turned. Yuzuha, meanwhile, began weaving again. There was a loom in the back of the inn, nearly forgotten. She repaired it quietly and began working with scraps of wool and silk, spinning them into shawls, small mats, narrow bolts of cloth. She said little, but each evening her fingers moved with quiet intention, her breath steady, her shoulders loose in a way they hadn't been in years. One afternoon, a village girl came to the inn with her mother. She carried a doll with a torn sleeve. Yuki, without being asked, knelt to inspect the damage. She took the doll gently, her hands certain, her voice kind. "I can fix this," she said. The girl looked at her as if she were magic. Yuzuha watched from the doorway. The next morning, more children arrived, first 1, then 2, then 4. Some brought old toys, others brought nothing at all, but they stayed, sat in a circle, listened to Yuki tell stories in a low, calm voice, stories that sounded made up but carried a thread of truth. About silver combs and silent midwives, about stone markers in the forest and names written in snow. Yuzuha never interrupted. She simply kept weaving. On the 7th evening, as the sun sank below the hills, the innkeeper approached her quietly. "There's an old house," she said, "abandoned for some time. It needs care, but it's yours if you want it." Yuzuha looked at her. "Why?" The woman shrugged. "Because I've seen how you both walk, not like strangers, like someone remembering their place in the world." Yuzuha said nothing for a long time, but the next day she and Yuki moved into the house. It was small, a single room, an attic space, a broken hearth. The roof needed patching, the garden was overgrown, the beams creaked in the wind, but it had light, windows that faced the east, and when spring came, Yuzuha planted mint beside the steps. Not because she expected it to take root, but because she knew it would. The first thaw came quietly. It arrived not with rain, but with softness, a loosening of the earth, the scent of damp moss rising from the ground. The river, once frozen in silence, began to murmur again beneath its thin veil of ice. In the mornings, the rooftops no longer glistened with frost. Instead, dew collected on windowsills and the innkeeper hung linens outside to dry, trusting the sun again. In the village, small changes stirred. Children shed their winter coats. Birds returned, hesitant at first, then bolder with each day. The bell at the temple began to ring more cheerfully, its tone echoing farther in the thinner air. And inside the little house on the eastern edge, life settled into something that almost resembled rhythm. Yuki began teaching. Not formally, not with scrolls or schedules, but naturally, wordlessly. Each day, 2 or 3 village children would knock at their gate, sometimes with questions, sometimes with nothing at all. And Yuki would receive them. She taught them how to braid, how to stitch seams that wouldn't unravel, how to listen without interrupting. And stories. Always stories. About girls who became smoke, about names folded into stones, about courage that didn't roar but whispered. She never used her old name. The villagers only knew her as Yuki, and they began to say it with the same respect they gave to the shrine maidens or the midwives. Yuzuha, meanwhile, had learned the rhythm of the loom again. In the corner of their house, she built a frame of wood polished by hand. She hung threads spun from mulberry bark and dyed with crushed plum skins. Her hands moved slowly but deliberately. Each length of cloth she wove was different, some patterned, others plain. But all of them held a softness that came from being made without rush, without performance, without debt. She sold them in the market once a week, quietly. She never bartered, never explained. People simply came, felt the cloth, and placed coins on the mat beside her. Some didn't speak, some thanked her. A few asked where she had learned to weave with such even tension. She only ever replied, "From women who held their breath too long." The villagers didn't press. One evening, after the children had left and the sun had dipped behind the ridge, Yuzua sat on the step of their home, combing her hair. The mint by the door had begun to sprout, small tender leaves pushing bravely through the frost-bitten soil. Yuki joined her, holding a cup of barley tea in both hands. "They asked me today if I was married," Yuki said with a half-laugh. Yuzua looked at her. "What did you say?" "I told them no, that I live with a woman who once stitched clouds into silk." Yuzua smiled faintly. "And they accepted that?" They nodded like it made perfect sense. A pause passed between them. Then Yuki added, "One of the boys asked me why I don't wear red." Yuzua raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I said red is for being watched. I wear colours I can disappear in." Yuzua considered that, then nodded. "Good answer." The wind stirred the trees. Yuki took a sip from her cup, then glanced sideways. "Do you think they'll come looking for us?" "No," Yuzua said. "They won't waste the effort. We're ghosts to them now." Yuki breathed out slowly. "Sometimes I wonder if I ever existed there, if I was real." Yuzua turned to her, meeting her gaze. "You were. You were made real the moment you chose your name." The fire inside the house crackled. A single bird chirped in the hedge, one of the first returning nightingales. Yuki said quietly, "I think I could stay here." Yuzua nodded. "Then you should." "And you?" Yuzuha's hands stilled, the comb pausing mid-stroke. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "There's still something in me that belongs to the road." "You're not tired?" "I am," she said, smiling, "but not finished." They sat in silence again. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the kind that arises between two people who understand each other without translation. That night, Yuzua lit a single candle on their altar. Not for prayer, just light. She placed a fresh slip of washi paper beside it, a blank one, and for the first time in years, she picked up a brush, not to write someone else's name, not to write a memory, but to begin her own story, not the one she had lived, but the one she still had left to tell. By the time the valley bloomed, the house had become part of the land. The frost receded into the shaded corners, and in its place came wildflowers, thin, persistent things that grew in the cracks of stone and the edges of the path. Bees returned in slow spirals, thick and golden, dusted with pollen. The persimmon tree near the gate wore the smallest hints of green, its branches no longer brittle but full of quiet possibility. Inside, the rhythm of days continued. Yuki rose early now, often before the birds. She would sweep the earth outside their house with a straw broom, pressing lines into the soil like brush strokes. Children arrived as the sun crested the hills. Some brought rice cakes or dried chestnuts as offerings. Others came empty-handed, but full of questions. Yuki gave them what they needed. Not always answers, but presence. She had learned to listen in the way Yuzua once had, with the full body, with stillness that spoke more loudly than advice. The girls especially sat close to her. They braided her sleeves. They mirrored her gestures. They wrote names on stones and buried them behind the mint bush, as if beginning their own rituals. Yuzua watched this from the window most mornings, and then she would return to her weaving. But the cloth had changed. It wasn't just for market anymore. She had begun making longer bolts now, wider lengths. She dyed them with persimmon tannin and red plum bark, layering colour upon colour until they darkened into shades she couldn't name. There was no rush in her fingers. Each thread felt like a breath, each pattern a whisper of something remembered. One afternoon, a traveller came through the village, a merchant, or perhaps a pilgrim. His robes were simple, but his posture told of long roads and careful eyes. He stopped at the market and bought a piece of Yuzua's cloth, folding it gently, reverently, before tucking it into his satchel. Then he bowed. "I've seen your work in Kyoto," he said. A noblewoman wore one of your shawls to the spring procession. She said it was woven by a ghost." Yuzuha said nothing, but she bowed in return, and when he left, she wrote a single line in her journal, "Even in forgetting, we are remembered." Later that day, Yuki found her sitting beneath the plum tree, the light catching in strands of her hair that had gone almost entirely silver. "You never talk about him," Yuki said, kneeling beside her. "Who?" "The one who brought you the letter, the comb." Yuzuha looked into the distance, where the hills met the sky like a folding screen half closed. "There's not much to say." "Did you love him?" Yuzuha thought for a moment. "No," she said softly, "but I was grateful to him. He was a door that opened, a hand that didn't hold, just pointed." Yuki nodded. "I wonder if someone will say that about me someday." "They will," Yuzuha replied. "They may not say your name, but they'll remember the door." Yuki leaned her head on Yuzuha's shoulder just for a moment. "You never had another child?" "No." "Did you want one?" Yuzuha smiled faintly. "I already had one." They sat beneath the plum blossoms, which had begun to fall in slow spirals, collecting on the sleeves of their robes and the pages of Yuzuha's open journal. Then Yuki asked, "Do you miss the girl you were?" Yuzuha closed her eyes. "No, but I miss her courage." Yuki turned toward her. "I think she's still here." Yuzuha reached for one of the petals and pressed it between the pages of her book. "So do I." That evening, after the fire was built and the tea poured, Yuzuha retrieved a small lacquered box from beneath her floor mat. She opened it with care, lifting out a folded parchment wrapped in silk. It was the original contract, the one that had bound her to the Okiya all those years ago. She hadn't burned it when she left. She hadn't buried it either. She had simply kept it, not out of fear, but as a witness. Yuki watched as Yuzuha unfolded the parchment and set it near the firelight. The ink was still legible, though faded at the edges. The name was hers. The terms were exact. The seal at the bottom a deep, dry red. Then Yuzuha took the comb, the one Sayuri had once kept in her obi, and laid it across the top of the parchment. Two pieces of her, side by side, what she had been made to be, and what she had chosen. She didn't burn the contract. She folded it again and placed it back in the box. But this time, the comb lay on top, and for the first time, the box felt light. The rains returned just after the full moon. Soft at first, mere mist, brushing through the valley like breath. Then, heavier, more determined. The sound of it filled the space between thoughts, tapping on the wooden roof, dripping from the edges of the eaves, streaming gently down the stones lining the garden path. It washed away the dust of early spring and brought with it a deep, wet greenness that soaked into everything. Inside the small house, the air smelled of rain-dampened wood and freshly steamed rice. Yuzuha sat near the window, her loom idle for once. Her hands were wrapped around a bowl of warm tea, the steam curling upward to fog the panes in a way that felt familiar, like something from a life long ago. She watched the path beyond the gate as it filled with puddles, tiny ones at first, then larger, reflecting the sky in broken pieces. She had dreamed the night before, of a corridor with red lanterns and lacquered floors, of footsteps echoing down a narrow hallway, but no faces, no voices, only the brush of silk and the faint scent of camellia oil. When she woke, her chest was tight with a feeling she couldn't name. Not sadness, not longing, just a ripple. Yuki came in from the rain with her sleeves rolled and her braids soaked through. She had helped one of the elder women in the village carry firewood up the hill, and her hands were streaked with ash and wet pine resin. Yuzuha reached for a cloth, patting her dry. "You didn't have to," she said gently. Yuki grinned. "She's 94 and still refuses to use a walking stick. I think carrying logs for her was less effort than arguing." They shared a quiet laugh. Yuki knelt beside the fire and began warming her hands. Then, without looking up, she said, "There's a traveling calligrapher staying at the inn, from Nagasaki." "Oh, he asked about you. Said he's seen your cloth in port markets. He called it woven memory." Yuzuha raised her brow. Poets always need something to name what they can't understand. "He wanted to meet you." Yuzuha turned back to the window. The rain slid down the glass in long, slow lines. "And what would I tell him?" she murmured. Yuki shrugged. "You could tell him how many breaths go into one bolt of fabric, or how much silence." Yuzuha smiled faintly. Silence. That had always been her first language. That evening the rain deepened, Thunder cracked once above the hills, but only as a warning, not a threat. The river rose, rushing fast beneath the footbridge. The wind smelled of wet grass and distant smoke. Yuki lit 2 candles, not out of need, there was still light left, but out of habit. Ritual. She placed one near the window, one near the hearth. Then slowly she brought out a bundle of papers. Not her own. These were old, yellowed. The folded notes from the Okiya, the ones they had once carried into the forest, hidden under stones and roots. Somehow Yuki had kept several of them, preserved, untouched. She laid them out on the table like relics. Yuzuha stared at them in silence. "You kept these?" she asked. "I couldn't leave them behind," Yuki said. "I didn't know why at the time, but I think I do now." She picked up one, unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words remained. "He said I was beautiful when I didn't speak, so I learned to stay quiet until I forgot my own voice." Yuki smoothed the edge with her thumb. Yuzuha reached for another. "Tonight he asked for my real name. I gave him a lie I've told so often. I think it may have been true." They read in silence for a long while. The rain thickened outside. One of the shutters groaned. Then Yuki asked, "Do you think these words ever made it anywhere?" Yuzuha looked at her. "They made it to us." Yuki folded the paper again. "We should give them back to the world." Yuzuha tilted her head. "How?" "Stories," Yuki said. "Not as warnings, not as shame, but as something whole." A pause. "Then, let me write them. Not just what was done, but what was lived." Yuzuha met her gaze. The fire flickered between them. "They didn't let us be witnesses," she said, "but we can be archivists." Yuki nodded. "I want the girls in the next town, 10 towns from here, to know that someone wrote them down, that their silence wasn't wasted." Yuzuha reached for a sheet of clean washi paper from the shelf, placed it between them. Then another, then ink, then a brush. No ceremony, just space. Yuki began to write, not perfectly, not quickly, but steadily. And as she wrote, Yuzuha whispered the names she remembered, the ones she never said out loud before. Each name was a candle, each sentence a comb passed from hand to hand. Outside, the rain softened into mist, and somewhere far beyond the valley, another girl, maybe awake in a distant district, maybe staring out a paper window of her own, felt for the first time that someone had finally said what she couldn't. By midsummer, the valley had turned to green fire. The fields shimmered with life, rice paddies layered like silver mirrors on the hillside, their flooded surfaces reflecting clouds that passed in slow procession overhead. Bamboo groves whispered in the heat, each gust of wind drawing music from leaves too tired to hold still. Cicadas screamed from dawn to dusk, loud enough to drown out thought. Even the river, once calm and smooth, now moved restlessly through its banks, swollen from upstream rains. In the small house by the eastern ridge, time shifted again. Not faster, not slower, just deeper. Yuki's pages had multiplied. What began as a stack of folded notes had become a careful archive, names written in the margins, ink faded and touched over again. She had arranged them by memory, by season, by feeling. Not chronologically, but emotionally. There were stories about laughter, even in cages. Stories about bruises hidden beneath brocade. Stories about small rebellions, tea poured slowly to avoid a touch, a hairpin dulled just enough to fail when expected. Yuzuha helped her shape them. She didn't write. She couldn't. Not anymore. But she spoke, slowly, deliberately. "Don't make them pretty," she said once. "Let the truth stay uneven." So Yuki left smudges on the pages. She didn't correct every stroke. She allowed the tremble of emotion to show in the lines. She let her writing breathe. The villagers, curious, began to ask what they were working on. Yuki only said, "Memories." Sometimes they nodded and said no more. Other times, they sat on the porch for hours, offering their own. A woman who had lost a sister to a brothel 3 prefectures away. A carpenter who once loved a geisha he could never afford. A boy who remembered his mother humming lullabies no one else believed belonged to her. Each voice a thread, each thread a length of cloth. And Yuzuha, though quieter than ever, felt the weaving continue even without the loom. She walked more slowly now, her joints stiffened with the heat, and her hands no longer gripped the shuttle as tightly. But her mind had grown more luminous. It reached further back with each passing day, unearthing things she had buried not to forget, but to survive. One evening, as the air thickened and the sky bruised with the promise of a storm, she told Yuki a story she had never spoken aloud. It was about the first man who asked for her name. Not her given name, not the one on her contract, but her real name. The one she'd whispered only to herself in the dark, like a spell no one else could hear. He asked after I sang for him, she said, and I told him a lie, because I didn't know who I was anymore. Yuki had paused in her writing. Do you remember what you told him? Yuzuha nodded. I said my name was Akari. It means light. It wasn't my name, but in that moment, I wanted it to be. Yuki had written it down. A line, barely a whisper. I named myself not out of truth, but out of need. Later, Yuzuha folded that page herself and tucked it into a box by the altar, not to hide it, but to let it rest. That night, thunder cracked above the valley. The rain returned in sheets, pouring from the roof like a river turned vertical. The garden overflowed, mint and lilies bending beneath the downpour. Inside, they sat by candlelight, reading old poems aloud, voices barely audible beneath the rain's insistence. Yuzuha's hands were wrapped around a warm cloth. Yuki's ink had smudged on her thumb. Neither of them minded. When the rain finally softened, long past midnight, the candles had burned low. Yuki closed her notebook and looked toward the door. Do you think she'll ever read them? She asked. Sayuri? Yuki nodded. Yuzuha leaned back, her eyes half closed. I don't know. Would you want her to? A long silence, then gently, only if she's ready, and only if she still wonders. They let the answer sit between them like steam from an untouched bowl of tea. Outside, the night air cooled. The cicadas had gone quiet. In their place came the frogs, soft, steady, persistent, calling across the paddies as if to say, we are still here, we are always here. And Yuzuha listened to them, thinking not of endings, but of how stories outlive their tellers, not in fame, not in records, but in the echo they leave inside those who need them most. Autumn returned as if it had never left. The heat receded in slow breaths. The air crisped gently, not in a rush, but in stages, as though the world had remembered how to exhale. The valley began to blush with copper and ochre. Leaves fell in spirals onto the river's surface, riding its gentle current like folded prayers. Even the wind changed its sound, less like a push, more like a whisper asking permission. In the small house at the edge of the village, Yuzuha rose earlier now. Not out of duty, but instinct. There was something in her bones, a pull toward quiet, toward stillness. She no longer wove every day. Her loom remained by the window, untouched but not abandoned. A blanket half-finished hung across it, threads still waiting for her hand. But she passed by it now without guilt. Instead, she sat on the step outside each morning, wrapped in shawls, a bowl of roasted barley tea warming her palms. Her hair, nearly white now, remained long, coiled at the nape of her neck. Her eyes held a softness Yuki hadn't seen before, not dulled, not fading, but released. Yuki kept writing. She had filled 3 full books now, each wrapped in silk, tied with cord, labelled with names she never said aloud except to the fire. Some nights she read from them. Other nights she simply held them, letting the weight of paper be a kind of anchor. She had begun carving wooden tablets too, small ones, no bigger than a hand. On each she etched a single word: escape, truth, before, after, remember. She planted them quietly at the edge of the garden. No one asked why. No one touched them. They became part of the path. On the 6th day of the 9th month, a letter arrived. It came not by courier, but with a travelling monk. He bowed at the gate, eyes soft behind a curtain of rain, and handed Yuki the folded paper without words. Yuki offered him food. He declined. Then he left. The paper was dry, sealed, written in a hand Yuzuha had not seen in years. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something harder to name. The letter was brief. Your daughter lives near the mountains now. She teaches children to read. She speaks often of a woman she once saw through plum blossoms, a woman with white hands and eyes like still water. She doesn't know your name, but she has never stopped wondering. There was no signature, only a pressed flower at the bottom, dried mint, preserved flat between the folds. Yuzuha read the letter twice. Then she placed it gently into a wooden box with a red cord and sat for a long time in silence. Later, as evening painted the hills in amber, she walked the long path to the shrine at the far edge of the village. Yuki followed quietly, but did not ask questions. They climbed the hill slowly. At the top stood the shrine, modest, open to wind and season. Its wooden beams bore the marks of weather and prayer. The bell was tarnished, the stone foxes mossed over. Yuzuha knelt before the altar and placed the mint flower on the offering tray. She bowed once, not deeply, but fully. Yuki stood beside her, watching. After a while, Yuzuha spoke. "She wonders." Yuki nodded. "Yes, she doesn't need to know me. She already does." They sat on the worn steps of the shrine as the sky faded into soft purples. The village lights flickered on, one by one. The scent of rice cooking drifted from somewhere below. Then Yuki turned. "There's more I want to write." Yuzuha smiled. "Then write. About you." Yuzuha looked out over the valley. "I was written already, in footsteps, in silence, in every girl who said no in her own way. But no one has heard it. They will." Yuki didn't press. She simply leaned against her, shoulder to shoulder, and closed her eyes. Below, the wind rustled the paddies. Leaves tumbled from the trees like loose pages, scattering across the land. And above, on the shrine's worn lintel, a spider spun her delicate web, thread by thread, an invisible net catching the last golden light of the day. Winter returned quietly, as if to listen. It did not rush down from the mountains with teeth bared, nor did it arrive with thunder or sudden snow. It crept in slowly on the backs of cold mornings, in the hush that fell over the valley before dusk. The river slowed, its waters thick and dark, and the trees held their breath beneath a sky that had turned the colour of old steel. In the small house near the ridge, the paper windows were repaired, the hearth lit early, and the paths lined with dried reeds to keep the snow from piling too quickly. Yuzuha no longer walked to the village each day. Her body, once quiet in its strength, had begun to grow soft at the edges. She rose later now, her movements deliberate, her breath shorter in the mornings. But she did not complain. There was no bitterness in the way she folded her robe or in the way she allowed Yuki to help lace her sleeves. "Everything takes more time," she said once, with a faint smile, "but I'm still here." Yuki adjusted her own routine with no ceremony. She brought tea before it was asked for. She stitched warm linings into Yuzuha's winter robes. She placed the comb, Yuzuha's comb, on the table each morning, brushing her hair with hands that had grown more practiced than her own. And still, she wrote. The fourth book had begun to fill, but the words came slower now, not because there was less to say, but because each word felt heavier. More sacred, as if the ink itself understood that it was being trusted with something final. One morning, as frost painted the garden stones and a low mist curled around the edges of the world, Yuki found Yuzuha sitting at the window with a folded square of fabric in her lap. It was the first obi Yuzuha had ever owned, not the expensive ones bought for show, but the simple indigo-dyed sash given to her as a camero, hand-woven, fraying at the edges. A relic of the girl she used to be, before the paint, before the fans, before the silence. Yuki knelt beside her. "You kept it," she said. Yuzuha's fingers moved slowly over the fabric. "I don't know why." Yuki said nothing. They both stared out the window for a long time, watching snow fall lightly, coating the mint plants, now brittle and bowed. Then Yuzuha asked, "Have you finished writing the story?" "Not yet." "Will you tell it all?" Yuki hesitated. "Only what you've given me." Yuzuha smiled faintly. "Then you'll tell enough." That evening, Yuki read aloud to her by firelight. She chose no names. She changed the order of events. She wove the truth with distance, softening its edges without dimming its weight. The woman in the story had no title, no house, no fixed past, but she had a daughter and a comb, and a trail of folded notes left in her wake like breadcrumbs made of breath. Yuzuha listened without blinking, and when it was done, she reached across the small space between them and took Yuki's hand. "Will you carry it now?" she asked. Yuki nodded. "Always." They sat there for a long while, until the fire had burned low and the wind had begun to speak through the cracks in the walls. Before bed, Yuzuha lit a single candle. She did not speak, but as she knelt before the altar, she took the folded obi and placed it beside the box of names. A quiet offering, not to the gods, but to the life she had lived. Outside, the snow continued to fall, not fast, not heavy, just steady. A hush falling over everything, a reminder that some stories end not with a flourish, but with a breath drawn deeply, and then released. The year turned once more. There was no celebration in the small house by the ridge, no clamour of bells, no lanterns hung with crimson ribbon, no guests offering sake or salt. Instead, the new year arrived as gently as a sigh, Snow still blanketed the fields. The trees remained bare, arms lifted in patient silence. Even the river, though beginning to thaw at the edges, moved with a slow, hesitant rhythm, as if unsure it was ready to return to motion. Inside the house, the air was warm and still. The brazier glowed in the corner, its coals soft with ember light. Steam rose from 2 bowls of miso soup, untouched for now, their surface dimpled with scallion and bits of mushroom. A small vase held 3 sprigs of pine, placed by Yuki just after dawn. Yuzuha sat wrapped in layers, her back straight, her eyes closed. Not asleep, just still, listening. She had become quieter in recent weeks, not out of pain, not even out of weakness, but with a calm that came from the knowledge that everything important had already been said, already been passed on. There was nothing left to hold on to tightly, and so she didn't. The body, too, seemed to understand. Each morning it moved a little less. Each evening it asked for rest a little earlier. The hands that once flew across the loom now curled softly in her lap, fingers laced like threads woven long ago and now at peace. Yuki sat beside her, brushing her hair. She had long since stopped counting how many times she had done this. It was a ritual now, gentler than breathing. She knew every bend in the comb, every silver strand. Her movements were careful but unhurried, a kind of quiet reverence shared only between women who had once survived by being unseen. A bird called from the edge of the garden. Just one note, clear, then gone. Yuzuha opened her eyes. "I heard it," she whispered. Yuki paused. "No," Yuzuha said softly, "the call." They said nothing more. Later that afternoon, the wind rose gently, tugging at the paper shutters. Yuki stood at the doorway, watching flakes drift down like petals from a withered sky. She held a bundle of parchment in her hands, the nearly finished manuscript. On its cover, no title, only a name she hadn't yet written. Behind her, Yuzuha rested. She no longer sat. She lay beneath the warm layers, her breath shallow but even. Yuki returned to her side and knelt. "I've written it," she said quietly. "Everything you told me, everything I saw." Yuzuha didn't speak, but her lips moved slightly. Yuki leaned closer. "I've left room at the end," she whispered, "for what comes next." A slow exhale, almost a smile. Then Yuzuha's eyes opened one last time. Clear, still. She looked at Yuki with no fear, no question, only recognition, and the kind of farewell that needed no words. Then her gaze shifted, upward, toward the beam in the ceiling where the first spiderweb of spring had begun to shimmer. And she let go. There was no cry, no collapse, just a breath, drawn in, then released like thread through fingers. And Yuzuha, woman of many names and none, was no longer bound by story. She had become part of it. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The air held that rarest kind of stillness, neither heavy with sorrow nor bright with celebration. Just true. As if the world itself had bowed its head. Yuki bathed her gently, wrapped her in soft linen, combed her hair until it gleamed. She did not dress her in finery. No rouge, no scent, just the indigo obi, the first one, the one from before. She placed a folded note in Yuzuha's hand, not signed, not sealed, only a single sentence. "I was seen." And when the sun rose, Yuki opened the doors and let the light in. Spring returned to the valley with a gentleness so complete it felt like forgiveness. The snow melted in silence, retreating from rooftops and stones, slipping away into the thirsty roots beneath the earth. Buds swelled on bare branches, plum, then cherry, then peach, each one a small defiant declaration that life, despite everything, continues. The river ran fuller now, no longer hesitant, but clear and eager, braiding its way through the land like an old story remembered by heart. The house by the ridge remained. Its walls held the scent of warm tea, old cedar, and something softer still, memory. Not the sharp kind that cuts when touched, but the kind that drifts in like incense, rising from quiet things. A comb on a shelf, a folded note under a cup, a line of footprints pressed gently into thawing soil. Yuki rose early, as always, but this morning was different. She wore white, not the white of mourning, but the white of renewal. Her sleeves were unembellished, her hair pinned simply. She had not cried in days, not because grief had passed, but because it had settled into her like a second skin. She carried it not like a burden, but like a lantern. At the center of the house sat a small altar, not grand, a low table draped in dark cloth. On it a folded bolt of cloth, unfinished, the weft trailing, a sprig of mint, freshly cut from the garden, and a candle. Yuki lit it just after sunrise, shielding the flame with her hand until it caught. Then she opened the door. The village came slowly, without announcement. They did not bring offerings or speeches. They brought themselves. An old man who once bought Yuzuha's cloth came and knelt quietly. A young girl who had listened to Yuki's stories placed a plum blossom at the step. The innkeeper, the carpenter's wife, the boy who had first brought her tea, all came and sat beneath the trees, saying nothing. Some stayed a moment, some stayed until dusk, and all of them looked not just at the altar, but at Yuki. Not with pity, but with respect, because they understood what had been built here, not just a house, not just a life, but a passage. That evening, after the last guest had gone, Yuki stepped barefoot into the garden. The earth was soft beneath her. The wind carried the scent of moss, of water, of distant hearth fires. She walked to the plum tree, the one that bloomed earliest, year after year, and beneath it she opened the last of the books, the fourth one. She turned to the final page, and wrote. Her name was not lost. It was carried, from silence to breath, from pain to paper, from one woman's hands to another's. And now, beyond even me, it continues. She closed the book, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in a wooden box with the others. Then, as night fell, she buried the box beneath the mint bush at the edge of the path. She did not mark it. She did not need to. The scent would be enough. The next morning, Yuki braided her hair and packed a small bundle. Just one robe, one book, and the comb. She walked to the village's southern road as the sun rose above the hills, gold spilling over the fields like warm silk. She turned once toward the house, toward the life they had made. Then she bowed, not to say goodbye, but in gratitude, and stepped forward. Her footsteps were quiet but certain, and behind her, in the soft breeze, the plum blossoms fell, not as endings but as beginnings, each one carrying a name no longer hidden, each one a story, each one a breath returned to the world.